When Steve Harvey was homeless and starving, he stole food to survive. Years later, his return to pay for what he took will move you to tears and prove that true character isn't defined by your worst moments, but by your willingness to make things right when you have the power to do so. It was January 1987, and 30-year-old Steve Harvey hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. He was living in his 1976 Ford Tempo, traveling from city to city, trying to get booked at comedy clubs, surviving on whatever money he could earn from $5 open mic nights and the occasional $20 gig at small venues that barely covered his gas money. Steve had been homeless for 6 months, and the romantic notion of chasing his dreams had given way to the harsh reality of simply trying to survive from one day to the next. On this particular winter morning in Cleveland, Ohio, Steve woke up in his car behind a shopping center, his stomach cramping from hunger and his body weak from malnutrition. "I need food," Steve said to himself as he looked at his wallet, which contained exactly $3.47, not enough for a decent meal, but enough for maybe a candy bar and a small drink. "I can't keep going like this." Steve had been in this situation before, but never for this long. His pride had prevented him from calling family members for help, and his dwindling list of friends were tired of his constant financial emergencies. He was completely on his own, with no safety net except his determination to make it as a comedian. As Steve walked through the shopping center looking for some place to buy the cheapest food possible, he passed Johnson's Family Grocery, a small, locally owned market that had been serving the community for over 20 years. Through the window, Steve could see the deli section with prepared foods, fresh sandwiches, and hot soup that made his mouth water and his stomach ache with desperate hunger. Steve walked into the store and headed toward the deli section, where the aroma of fresh food was almost overwhelming to someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. He saw containers of hot soup, rotisserie chicken, fresh sandwiches, and prepared salads that represented the kind of nourishing meal his body desperately needed. "Can I help you?" asked Mrs. Rosa Johnson, the elderly woman working behind the deli counter. "Just looking," Steve replied, trying to hide his desperation while calculating whether his $3.47 could buy him anything substantial. Steve walked around the store for 15 minutes, picking up items and checking prices, putting them back when he realized he couldn't afford them. A can of soup cost $2.89, a loaf of bread was $1.99, a small container of milk was $2.49. Everything he looked at cost more than the meager amount of money in his wallet. As Steve stood in the soup aisle, holding a can of chicken noodle soup and trying to decide whether to spend almost all of his money on one meal, he felt something break inside him. The combination of hunger, exhaustion, desperation, and the overwhelming sense that he might not survive much longer made him consider something he had never considered before in his entire life. Steve looked around the store to make sure no one was watching, then slipped the can of soup into his jacket pocket. The action happened so quickly that he barely registered what he had done until it was over. "What am I doing?" Steve thought to himself, his heart racing as he realized he had just stolen food for the first time in his life. But his hunger was stronger than his shame, and Steve found himself walking toward the bread aisle, where he slipped a small loaf of bread into his other jacket pocket. Then he went to the dairy section, and after checking to make sure the coast was clear, took a small container of milk and tucked it under his arm, concealed by his jacket. Steve walked toward the exit, his heart pounding so loudly he was convinced everyone in the store could hear it. As he approached the door, he expected alarms to sound, security guards to appear, or someone to shout, "Stop, thief!" But nothing happened. He walked out of Johnson's Family Grocery with stolen food, becoming something he had never been before: a criminal. Steve sat in his car in the parking lot, staring at the stolen food with a mixture of relief and disgust. He was grateful to have something to eat, but he was horrified by what he had become. "This is not who I am," Steve said to himself as he opened the can of soup with a can opener he kept in his car. "But I don't know what else to do." Steve ate the soup, bread, and milk sitting in his car, and it was the most nourishing meal he had eaten in days. But every bite was flavored with shame and the knowledge that he had crossed a line he never thought he would cross. Over the next several years, as Steve's comedy career slowly began to take off, he carried the memory of that theft with him like a weight on his soul. Even as he started getting better gigs, Even as he began earning enough money to eat regularly, even as his career progressed toward the success that would eventually make him one of the most recognizable entertainers in America, Steve never forgot about the food he had stolen from Johnson's family grocery. "I would lay awake at night thinking about Mrs. Johnson and her family," Steve would later reflect. "I had stolen from people who were probably struggling themselves, just trying to make a living with their small neighborhood grocery store." The guilt became more intense as Steve's success grew. Every time he paid for groceries without having to count every penny, every time he threw away food because he had cooked too much, every time he took abundance for granted, he remembered that can of soup, that loaf of bread, and that container of milk that he had taken without paying. By 1995, Steve Harvey was a successful comedian with his own television show, a comfortable income, and financial security he had never imagined during those desperate years of homelessness. But success hadn't erased the memory of his theft, and the guilt had actually intensified rather than diminished over time. "The more successful I became, the worse I felt about what I had done," Steve explained. "I realized that Mrs. Johnson probably never knew what I had taken, but I knew, and I couldn't live with myself anymore without making it right." On a cold February morning in 1995, exactly 8 years after the theft, Steve Harvey drove to Cleveland, Ohio, with a specific mission: to find Johnson's family grocery and pay for the food he had stolen nearly a decade earlier. Steve wasn't sure the store would still be in business, or if Mrs. Johnson would still be working there, or even if she would remember him. But he knew he had to try to make amends for what he had done. When Steve pulled up to the shopping center where Johnson's family grocery had been located, he was relieved to see that the store was still there, looking almost exactly as it had 8 years earlier. He sat in his car for several minutes, gathering the courage to go inside and confess to a crime that no one knew he had committed. Steve walked into the store, and to his amazement, Mrs. Rosa Johnson was still working behind the deli counter, looking only slightly older than she had been 8 years earlier. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Johnson asked, not recognizing the well-dressed, successful man as the desperate homeless person who had been in her store years earlier. "Mrs. Johnson, my name is Steve Harvey, and I need to tell you something that happened 8 years ago." Mrs. Johnson looked puzzled, but gave Steve her full attention. "8 years ago, I was homeless, hungry, and desperate. I came into your store and I stole food. I took a can of soup, a loaf of bread, and a container of milk because I hadn't eaten in days and I was afraid I might starve." Mrs. Johnson stared at Steve, trying to process what he was telling her. "I've carried the guilt of that theft for 8 years," Steve continued. "I've become successful since then, but I've never been able to forget what I did in your store. I'm here to pay for what I took, with interest, and to apologize for stealing from you and your family." Steve reached into his wallet and pulled out $100. "I know the food I took probably cost less than $5, but I want to pay you $100 to cover what I took, plus interest for the 8 years I've owed you this debt." Mrs. Johnson was quiet for a long moment, tears forming in her eyes as she looked at Steve. "Young man," she finally said, "do you know what you've just done?" "I've tried to make right something I did wrong," Steve replied. "No, you've done much more than that. In 23 years of running this store, I've had people steal from me hundreds of times, but you are the first person who has ever come back to pay for what they took." Mrs. Johnson refused to take the $100. "I won't take your money, but I want to tell you something. What you did 8 years ago was wrong, but what you're doing today shows the kind of man you really are. People make mistakes when they're desperate, but character is what you do when you have choices. Mrs. Johnson, please take the money. I need to pay this debt. The only thing I'll accept is if you promise me that you'll tell this story to other people. Tell them that integrity isn't about never making mistakes. It's about making things right when you have the power to do so." Steve was so moved by Mrs. Johnson's response that he broke down crying right there in the grocery store. "Mrs. Johnson, you've just given me more than I could ever give you. You've given me forgiveness and peace." Steve and Mrs. Johnson talked for over an hour that day. She told him about her family, her struggles with the store, and her philosophy about human nature and redemption. Steve told her about his comedy career, his journey from homelessness to success, and how the guilt of his theft had motivated him to be a better person. When Steve finally left the store, Mrs. Johnson walked him to the door and said something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Mr. Harvey, what you stole from me 8 years ago was food. What you've given me today is faith in human nature. Thank you for showing me that good people sometimes do bad things, but they always try to make them right." Steve kept his promise to Mrs. Johnson. He has told the story of his theft and redemption hundreds of times in interviews, speeches, and conversations with young people who are struggling with their own moral challenges. "I learned something important from that experience," Steve often says. "Desperation can make you do things you never thought you would do, but character is what brings you back to make things right." Steve also established a fund to help struggling families in Cleveland buy groceries, making sure that no one in Mrs. Johnson's neighborhood would have to choose between hunger and theft. Mrs. Johnson passed away in 2008, but not before she and Steve had developed a friendship that lasted 13 years. She attended several of Steve's comedy shows, and Steve made sure that Johnson's family grocery was supported and promoted within the community. At Mrs. Johnson's funeral, Steve delivered a eulogy in which he credited her with teaching him the most important lesson of his life: that redemption is always possible for people who have the courage to face their mistakes and make amends. "Mrs. Johnson taught me that stealing food when you're starving doesn't make you a thief," Steve said. "It makes you human. But coming back to pay for it when you're successful, that's what makes you a man." Today, Steve keeps a photo in his office of himself and Mrs. Johnson standing in front of Johnson's family grocery, both of them smiling. Next to it is a can of chicken noodle soup, the same brand he stole 37 years ago, as a reminder that character isn't about never falling down, but about always getting back up and making things right. Steve Harvey's story of theft and redemption proves that our worst moments don't define us, but our willingness to face our mistakes and make amends reveals who we really are when no one is forcing us to do the right thing. If this powerful story of desperation, redemption, and the courage to make things right years later moved you, please subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that past mistakes don't define future character. Have you ever had to make amends for something you did in a desperate moment, or witnessed someone's courage in facing their past mistakes? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about redemption, integrity, and the beautiful things that happen when people choose to do what's right even when no one is watching.